right now, like, all of world politics and everything is happening is very overshadowed by the real-time genocide we're seeing unfold in Gaza and the sort of mass brutality, the massacre, and not just the barbarism of Israel's actions, the inspirational quality of the resistance, but the complicity of our own rulers, of Biden, of Albanese, of Sunak, all across the Western world, these so-called champions of freedom and democracy. And one of the things I just wanted to introduce before I properly get to Ukraine that's been mentioned again and again, like I saw the spokesperson of APAN mention the other night in a talk, a Palestinian advocate, the stark contrast between the West's response to Ukraine and their response to Gaza, where with Ukraine, following the Russian invasion, which we've just passed the 2-year anniversary, they came out, you know, this is a cause for democratic and free people to support, we'll give them arms, we'll sanction Russia, we'll do this, we'll do that. And with Ukraine, with Gaza, you get the opposite. They're, you know, arming Israel to the teeth, denying visas to Palestinians, cutting aid. So people have pointed that out again and again, the hypocrisy of that situation, of what we've seen from our rulers. And I think one of the ways that it's important to relate it to Ukraine is it raises the question, if these people are complete hypocrites, if they're willing to support genocide before all our eyes, not only support it rhetorically, but arm the people doing it and defend them, then what is actually motivating them in Ukraine? Is it all the things that they're saying, the freedom, the democracy, the opposition to Putin's authoritarianism, or is it, you know, something different? And it's a slight tangent, but one of the explanations I've seen people raise is pointing out that, well, Ukrainians are white and Middle Eastern people and Arabs in Gaza are the ones getting killed, so they don't care in that case, and that's why they're hypocritical. And I think it's very right to see the way imperialism and racism go hand in hand, and they use it to justify, you know, their double standards, their hypocrisy, their wars, their invasions across the Middle East. But I also think racism is a symptom, not the cause, and it can't explain imperialist policy, what Marxists would call imperialist policy, as a whole. For example, there was a time when the United States was saying the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were freedom fighters when they were fighting the USSR. Then they come back later and say, no, all these people in Afghanistan are a bunch of terrorists. And I think the compass that guides them is what Marxists would call their imperialist interests. So that's what I wanted to sort of draw out in this talk about Ukraine. Look at the imperialist interests behind it and, you know, go over, you know, why our governments have been so keen to pour fuel on the fire of this war, but also dig into why we don't see Ukraine, unlike the Palestinians, as a war of national liberation or of national defence. We actually see it as a proxy war between imperialist powers. So the people of Ukraine being crushed between, you know, competing imperialisms of Russia on the one hand and the United States, Europe and NATO on the other. And that makes it a very, very different kind of conflict where we need to stand against our own leaders pouring fuel on the fire with their arms shipments and their military aid, as well as standing in solidarity with the anti-war movement in Russia. But also I wanted to touch on a couple of other things, which is how Marxists explain this clash of imperialisms that we're seeing in Ukraine, but also, as was mentioned last session, something that's accelerating all over the world, and that the horror in Gaza has only exposed in its most naked form. And then the final thing I wanted to touch on was just the way this is feeding into a political crisis for the United States, the West and NATO, as it becomes clearer and clearer that their relative strength on the world stage is declining, that, you know, what they thought was going to happen in Ukraine and what has actually happened, what they said was going to happen in Ukraine and what has actually happened are very, very different things. So just to get into looking at Ukraine to begin with and talking about the war there, I just wanted to start with the fact that it's the 2nd year anniversary of the war that's just passed at the start of this year. And if you look at this time last year, leaked US government documents were saying there were 354,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers killed or injured, you know, tens of thousands of dead, 60,000 they estimated. And now the UK Ministry of Defence is saying just Russia alone, 355,000 casualties, and a lot of estimates I've seen have said over 500,000 casualties on both sides and over 100,000 dead. So it's a massive, massive bloodbath. It is absolute, you know, barbarism, murder and destruction, fueled by the weapons that are coming out of the United States, Australia and NATO, as well as by Putin and Russia. And the type of warfare is World War I style attritional warfare. That's why there's such a incredible number of deaths and casualties. And I think one of the things to say about it is, you know, for everything that's been said about the Ukraine war being a, you know, battle for freedom and democracy, and it's not long until, you know, there's victory against Putin's authoritarianism. The past year, the front lines have not moved. Like, you can hold up a map of this time last year and now it's the same, essentially. Maybe if you get a magnifying glass, you can see a bit of difference. But the only thing that has changed really is the massive, massive body count and the profits of the people that are, you know, selling weapons to fund this butchery. So, yeah, you look at, I saw an interview in the New York Times recently by this guy, Alexei Yukov, who's like a civilian who goes to the front lines and gets the bodies out so they can be repatriated or go back to their families. And he was saying he's going into the trenches, there's bodies 5 deep, and the ones at the top are wearing summer uniforms and the ones at the bottom are wearing winter uniforms. So that's the kind of level of butchery that you're seeing continue in Ukraine in the background, essentially, as the Israel's onslaught continues in Gaza as well. But I think as well, if you look back at the middle of last year, we were being told that Ukraine was going to launch an enormous counter-offensive. They were going to sever the land bridge that Russia has between the eastern areas that it's taken over and the strategic peninsula of Crimea, which is home to a very important naval base. They are saying we're going to cut through that with this Ukrainian offensive. They've been armed to the teeth by the United States and NATO. They got all the best weapons, and you know, we're going to bring Russia to its knees. So, you know, you look at the newspapers at that time, the ruling class press, the politicians, the Economist is saying Ukraine's counteroffensive is gathering pace. They're talking about the new snow tractors, which are going to bring them victory, all these things on and on and on about how this is going to be this glorious defeat for Russia. And it really does remind you of the delusional rantings of imperialist rulers at the start of World War I. It'll be over soon, it'll just be one quick onslaught and then we'll have glory and victory. And now you look at it, it is, you know, an absolute horror, and the front lines you know, effectively haven't moved. So the much celebrated and anticipated counter-offensive was a complete failure. Ukraine lost 20% of its weapons in the first 2 weeks. And yeah, all they had for the billions of dollars of weapons was, you know, thousands and thousands of dead conscripts who'd been shoveled into these killing fields. Because what they were trying to do basically is charge into heavily fortified Russian areas full of landmines, trenches, defensive fortifications and artillery. They're just feeding people into this bloodbath. But I think the other thing about that failed counteroffensive, which started in the middle of last year, is it made it very, very clear this was not a war of national liberation. It wasn't something that Ukrainians really had a say in starting or continuing or fighting in the case of the conscripts who were shoveled into this thing. So you can look at the counteroffensive itself as a case study in a proxy war. So 9 of the 12 combat brigades involved in the counteroffensive were US and ally partner trained and equipped. There's 150 NATO. NATO is like the US dominated military alliance with Europe that originated in the Cold War. NATO trained and equipped 150 NATO military personnel on the ground in Ukraine. There was, according to the New York Times, US generals going weekly to Ukraine to make sure they were conforming with the strategy. And it's quite blatant the way US politicians, and you could find a long list, and military top brass and the rest of it were talking about the advantages of doing this in Ukraine. So just one example, Mitt Romney, the senator from the United States, said, cheering on this bloodbath, is saying, this is the best national defence spending I think we've ever done. We're losing no lives in Ukraine, but we're diminishing and devastating the Russian military. So, in other words, they can fight this war against Russia with United States weapons and Ukrainian dead. And you see the same sort of sentiments on and on through the ruling class press and the upper echelons of the US state. At certain points, they even leak to the media complaining that, you know, yeah, we're doing human waves attacks into these heavily fortified areas, but they're not. The Ukrainians aren't putting enough people into the human wave attacks. We need more. They said it in a more polite way. They said, Ukraine is becoming too casualty averse, but that's what they meant. What are you doing? Like, you could be laying heavier blows on Russia if you would just shovel more people into the front lines. So I guess the point with that is it illustrated the war is very clearly driven by the West, providing the arms, the strategy, and the political push to continue the conflict. But I think in order to understand that behaviour as well, it's worth just going back to the lead up to the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And looking at what was actually happening, because while we would condemn the Russian invasion, stand in solidarity with the Russian anti-war movement, here we have to be very, very clear of the West's culpability. So if you go back to the end of the Cold War in 1990, NATO told Gorbachev, we're not going to expand east of Germany if there's German unification. By 2019, 12 new NATO bases expanding towards Russia. Now Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. Then in 2014, Ukraine went through a period of massive instability, which basically involved mass protests, but it degenerated into a battle between pro-Western oligarchs and pro-Russian oligarchs over who was going to control the country. And the United States and NATO backed in, obviously, the pro-Western oligarchs. There were phone calls leaked about them discussing who should be in the new Ukrainian government. They got their way and then poured tens of billions of dollars into Ukraine to make their military interoperable with NATO. In other words, to turn Ukraine into an extension of their imperialist power. For Ukraine wasn't yet in NATO, but NATO was in Ukraine. The third thing about that context that's worth saying as well is that on the brink of the war, Putin was saying, we don't want Ukraine in NATO, and the US was like, well, we're not renouncing that, sorry. We don't care what you do, we're not renouncing that. And this is despite the fact 2 years previous, the CIA director, Bill Burns, had said, the reddest of all red lines for Russia is Ukraine membership in NATO. So they knew what they were doing. They 100% knew what they were doing. They knew what they were risking, but they were willing to do it because they weren't going to pay the political price, was their thinking. And even if it did degenerate into war, it would weaken Russia, and that was to their advantage for reasons I'm going to discuss soon. So then the final thing was, once the war actually started, there was discussions of peace talks like 2 weeks in, and it's now widely accepted Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister at the time, as the emissary of NATO and the West, went to Ukraine and said, no, forget about these peace talks. We want full-scale war against Russia, killed the peace talks and announced weapons shipments. So that's the West culpability. That's their sort of role in not just pouring fuel on the fire of the war, but bringing it about in the first place. And I won't have time to go into it in detail, but I think it's very important that we don't see that type of behaviour on the world stage by major capitalist powers as a policy mistake or someone got a rush of blood to the head. Actually, a major capitalist power, in order to guarantee the profits of its corporations, has to intervene on the world stage militarily to get the trade routes, to get the raw materials, to get the markets, to get the advantage over its rivals and make sure its companies are the ones that profit globally. And that is the fundamental driver behind what's happening, what Marxists call imperialism, that process of, the domination of the globe, the division of the globe amongst the biggest capitalist powers that arises from the competitive drive within capitalism itself. So just one example of the Marxist theory of this is Vladimir Lenin, who wrote Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism during World War I. And he said imperialism means the partitioning of the world and high monopoly profits for a very rich handful of countries. So I think to go to how this specifically relates to Ukraine, though, I think it's important to understand, and touching on something someone said in the last session, it's not actually just about NATO versus Russia or US versus Russia or Putin. A very big part of the West's footing in this conflict, their willingness to take it to the depths that it's been taken, is actually behind that the much more serious rivalry between the US and China. Unlike Russia, China has the capacity now to become a peer competitor to the United States, to become a full-blown rival to the United States in its own right. Militarily, it's still nowhere near that in terms of who's got the 10 aircraft carriers, who's got the 600 military bases around the world, 700. However many it is, it's still the United States is top dog, but China has the capacity to challenge that, and in its own region is becoming more and more assertive about, we're not just going to let the United States run the show and indefinitely control our shipping lanes and all these other things in the South China Sea over Taiwan. And I think that backdrop is part of what has made Ukraine very important for the West, for the United States, because in terms of being the big imperialist power, yeah, they've got the immense military might, but they also did just get smashed out of Afghanistan by the Taliban not too long ago. So Ukraine became a way for them to revive their imperialist credentials on the world stage with a particular view to China. So if you look at the director of the CIA, Bill Burns again, he states this quite directly this month in the debate over continued military support for Ukraine by the United States. He says, if we're seen to be walking away from support for Ukraine, not only is this going to feed doubts amongst our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to stoke the ambitions of the Chinese, ranging from Taiwan to the South China Sea. So they're saying, if we don't punch a hole in Russia and show what happens if you challenge our self-appointed domination of every region of the world, if we don't set an example of them, it's going to embolden China, and that's why we need to keep pouring in the weapons and do maximum damage as possible. It's also one of the important ties of Australia to the conflict. Albanese has been a staunch supporter of the war in Ukraine, poured almost $1 billion into it, and it's very tied to the AUKUS alliance, the pact for the 368 billion nuclear submarines, and the push on China that Australia is involved in here. On the anniversary of the war, he made a point of announcing another $50 billion in largely military aid. He sent the Bushmaster armoured vehicles, which they rolled out at O Week at UNSW to Ukraine, and so on. So now I just wanted to finish up, look at the way what's happening in Ukraine has created a military crisis that has rebounded on the West. But just to start, it's worth mentioning, we were told this was a war for freedom, democracy against authoritarianism. You look at Ukraine now, It is a militarised, authoritarian, neoliberal state of the worst kind. The President Zelensky literally stated he wanted Ukraine to become a big Israel with, armed guards at every shopping centre and cinema. You look at the policies he's pushed through, banning left-wing political parties, push through laws that destroy the right for unions to collectively bargain, mass privatisation. The big, just one indicator is the big food multinationals, Cargill, Monsanto and DuPont now own 40% of Ukraine's arable land. So in terms of an anti-imperialist struggle for self-determination, they're sending Ukrainians into this meat grinder, and then behind the front lines, the imperialist interests, the oligarchs, the capitalists are gobbling up everything behind the front line like a pack of hyenas. But yeah, I think the war weariness that's now emerging in Ukraine, the fact that they're more and more facing opposition to the draft and conscripting people into the war, that even last year they were reporting they're driving around provincial towns with vans waiting at the station to find people who are dodging the draft and stick them in the van and take them off to die in Bakhmut or wherever it is. There's more and more discontent about the difference between the glory Ukrainians were promised out of this and the manifest reality. But yeah, just to sort of finish, I think the defeat of the counteroffensive, the increasing difficulties of Ukraine actually being able to wage the war because it's running out of people, and the political divisions within the United States, which is now trying to throw its weight behind another imperialist conflict where it's backing Israel, are very, very significant and important. This is causing serious panic in the United States. Biden's $60 billion package of support for aid for Ukraine has been jammed in the Congress because of Republican opposition. This has led to panic in Europe and lunatic statements by people like French President Emmanuel Macron, who earlier in the year said he would refuse to rule out sending French troops directly into Ukraine, which would mean a war between a NATO state, nuclear armed states on both sides, which is, immensely dangerous and potentially catastrophic. So, yeah, you've had this situation where the West thought it was going to bring Russia to its knees. It hasn't actually done that. Russia's been able to, and Putin has been able to survive the sanctions. Most of the world hasn't even adhered to them, despite the West saying the whole world was behind the war. They've been able to militarise their industries and produce an extraordinary amounts of armaments that now the West is struggling to keep up with because they're sending so many munitions to Israel to rain down on Gaza. So this underlines what we talk about, the declining relative strength of the United States and the Western powers on the world stage in a very stark way. Just the political crisis that is emerging if Trump wins the election, the doubt that puts over the continued support, what that means for Europe trying to remilitarise to the greatest extent possible is very, very serious. But I think, what I wanted to finish on is that declining strength of the US doesn't make the situation less dangerous or mean the world is going to get less imperialist. Actually, an injured beast can be the most dangerous. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing it in a very naked form in Israel, in what they've been willing to resort to in Ukraine, the brinkmanship, walking the line of nuclear war with Russia that they've been quite willing to throw themselves into because of the rivalry with China. This is the future they are promising us, and I really, really take the point from the last session that it is the time to build the strongest possible resistance to stop the butchery in Gaza, but understand that this is the rule, not the exception. This is the rule, what's happening in Gaza, in capitalism's history. in terms of what they're willing to do to defend their system, to defend their profits, to defend their empires. And we need an anti-imperialist movement that can fight on every front to stop the arms shipments, to stop the onslaught in Gaza, to stop the drive to war on China, and stand in solidarity with others doing the same, including those in Russia like the left-wing author Boris Kagarlitsky, who was just jailed for 5 years by Putin for speaking out against the war. So we've seen Gaza expose the horror of imperialism, the hypocrisy of imperialism, but we need to turn that horror into anti-imperialist action everywhere.